and welcome to Novel Feelings, where two psychologists take a deep dive into your favorite books. I'm Priscilla.
And I'm Elise. Today we have an interview with Buist and Graeme Simsion, authors of the Menzies Mental Health series, that is The Glass House and the Oasis, which came out earlier this year. We have a lot to talk about, including the complexity of the mental health care system, balancing technical accuracy with storytelling, and telling the lived experience of healthcare professionals while also prioritising the rights of people living with complex mental health issues.
So Graeme Simsion is the internationally best-selling author of The Rosie Project, The Rosie Effect, The Rosie Result, and The Best of Adam Sharp. Anne Buist is the author of the psychological thrillers Medea's Curse, Dangerous to Know, This I Would Kill For, and The Long Shadow. She is also the professor of women's mental health at the University of Melbourne. Anne and Graeme have co-authored Two Steps Forward and Two Steps Onward and live together in Melbourne, Australia. We have previously interviewed Graeme about the legacy of the Rosie Project and Anne about her book, Lock Ward. So please check out those episodes.
And a little bit about the books. So trainee psychiatrist Dr. Hannah Wright has only just got her head above water in the acute psychiatric ward at Menzies Hospital when she's thrown in the deep end of the outpatient clinic. Keen to develop her skills in talking therapies, she finds herself up against a boss who's focused on medication and a senior colleague with a score to settle. While Hannah comes under pressure to seek therapy herself to confront a traumatic past, her patient's health issues range from OCD to ice addiction, childhood abuse to the mental impact of aging, and from bad parenting to bad genes. They all come to the Oasis. And the Oasis is out now through Hachette Publishing. Please check out our show notes for disclaimers and content notes.
Welcome to the pod again, Graeme and Anne. Thank you so much for joining us today. And congratulations on the publication of the latest novel in the Menzies Mental Health series, The Oasis. What has the reception been like to the series so far?
Well, we started off, of course, with The Glass House, and we started off with a bit of a bang because we visited every bookshop in Australia, or we certainly tried to get to all 400. We clocked up. So, and we did about 110 or more events, and then we've done some events with the Oasis as well. And so we've had a chance to talk to a lot of readers. And there's two very distinct groups. One are the health professionals who, the psychiatrists in particular, get PTSD, in inverted commas, and not literally, just by reliving their training experiences, and find it very authentic. And it's amazing how many similar things have happened to so many different people and how many different professors are vying for the supposed who Professor Ron Gordon was based on or inspired by. So that's the health professionals, and likewise other health professionals, mental health nurses, OTs, physios, psychologists have been very positive about the depiction of their profession, which we don't get very often in a positive way. If you look at Nurse Ratched as being the prototype mental health professional from The One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But the other group, which is much more kind of close to my heart, is the families, and in some cases the lived experience people, but the families of lived experience have given us an enormous amount of positive feedback about how it has sort of filled in a blank for them, that their family member was admitted to a mental health hospital. It was probably all fairly difficult time for everyone, and whilst a lot might have been explained to them, I think it's a bit like, when you have a cancer diagnosis, when you're told your son has schizophrenia for the first time, you don't really hear anything after that for a while. So this allowed them, in the fullness of later time, to really make sense of the experience they'd had.
And a number of them have said that it gave them an understanding of what went on behind the scenes. So they'd had a particular perspective when you're in hospital of what's going on. But this is, of course, the picture that's going on from the clinician point of view. Now, of course, there's not much point. Well, it's lovely to write a book that people like and that's authentic, but not much help if people don't read it. We've been very happy with the commercial aspect of it. The Glass House was Hachette's best-selling novel on their Australian list last year. So that really exceeded ours and theirs expectations. So, and number one bestseller on the indie book list. So that, again, was nice to have.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Huge achievements. Yeah, well done.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful insight for me as well as a psychologist who only has worked in the private settings, because I know a little bit about what happens in the hospital, but not to that extent. I have to ask, what inspired the Great Australian Bookshop Trip?
Well, there were two reasons. I think the
Mm.
first, and is explained implicitly, was to get the message out, to talk about mental health, particularly out in regional and rural areas. So to go on the road with a mental health message.
Well, the Rosie Project was kind of part of the wave of changing in attitudes to autistic community, neurodiversity. And I was watching this wave and how the autistic community adopted Don Tillman as just kind of such a great sort of avatar for them. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if a fiction book about mental health could do that? Because both of us have written technical books, and whilst his data modelling book did okay, I think probably 50 people read my psychiatric disorders associated with childbirth, A Guide to Management, whereas fiction can access a very different group and a much bigger group potentially. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if it could just be part of a wave of decreasing stigma?
And the other aspect of it was the Rosie Project wasn't automatically originally a big success because it didn't fit nicely into any particular category. And it really relied on being hand sold by bricks and mortar booksellers. So we were out to ask them to do that favour again for us with the Glass House, because we'd had a lot of pushback from publishers. Mental health is grim. People won't want to read about it. I mean, these are publishers who probably make most of their money selling crime books, about murder.
Yeah.
But mental health is too grim. And also both books, the Glasshouse and the Oasis, are episodic. They're like a TV season. So you have 13 episodes, each one of which explores a particular patient with ongoing clinical characters. It's not a common structure for a novel. It's a storytelling structure that we think most readers will be familiar with from television. But again, it was just a little bit unusual, and we wanted to get out, have those conversations with booksellers, and hopefully have them on our side.
And what were the logistics like of visiting so many bookstores? Like, how were you traveling around? How did you organize yourselves? Were you literally on the road for hundreds of days straight?
Well, Anne describes me as the admin guy, so logistics was ultimately my baby. We spent 5 months on the road. We were out in a four-wheel drive with stuff emblazoned on the side about the Great Australian Bookshop Tour. And we planned it pretty meticulously. I think in the end, there were about 5 or 6 bookshops we didn't make, and only, I don't think any of those were our fault. There you go. They were all on our tour list, but there was one that opened late one day and we just couldn't make it. There were a couple that didn't want to see us. But at the end of the day, it was about 5 months on the road. We used some trains and planes as well, but we did about 30,000 kilometres in the car.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing.
Very, very impressive. As someone who gets homesick after being away for maybe 2 weeks, I cannot imagine the feeling of doing that. But huge achievements all around. So well done. So bringing us back to the Oasis, so the most recent book in the series, in your acknowledgement section for that book, you say that these books have been inspired by the courage of patients and the dedication of mental health workers. There are those that argue that mental health stories should be told only from the perspective of lived experience rather than by clinicians like Hannah Wright, who's the protagonist of the books, of course. We believe that if we are to improve our attitudes, approaches, and systems, we need a better understanding of the needs and experiences of all parties. We hope the Oasis will contribute to that understanding. Can you share a little bit more about your thoughts on this topic?
Well, we had one publisher who said they would not publish the book because, for exactly what you said, mental health stories should be told from the point of view of lived experience, meaning lived experience of somebody who has mental health issues. I used to work in business consulting, and there may well be some parallels here with psychology as well. If you want to move forward, if you want to get angry, you only need one perspective. You only need one person screaming and saying, I was cheated, I was ripped off, whatever happened, I've been treated badly. If you want to move forward with the way that you do things and with changes to systems and behaviours, you need to get everybody's point of view on the table and understand where they're coming from, because nobody much gets up in the world, twirls their moustache and says, today I do evil. They get up doing what they think is the right thing. And if we're going to move forward, we're going to have to change their behaviours, and that means that we need to see them all. And certainly the feedback that Anne was talking about before suggests that people with lived experience appreciate seeing the other side of the story.
And Hachette's were very enthusiastic and continue to be very enthusiastic about the series. And their attitude was it was being told from lived experience, but lived experience of a mental health worker. And we just try and balance that with patients' point of view as empathetically and accurately and authentically as possible. And there is a lot out there, and there needs to be a lot out there written by lived experience people with mental health issues. And memoirs are fabulous, but they really can't do that balance, because if you're writing authentically from lived experience as someone who's been involuntarily put into a psychiatric setting, then you're obviously going to see the nurses, the doctors as other, as the oppressors, and it's going to be very hard. And we've had that feedback from lived experience that they were a bit shaken by the fact that doctors and nurses are human beings in our book. They have flaws and foibles and they're not perfect, and they sometimes use Google to work out how to do things. And we really wanted that balance.
I mean, this argument about power differentials, it would be hard to argue that the clinicians didn't have more power than the patients. But equally, the clinicians are frequently working in a situation where they lack the power that they would like to have, because there are administrators and executives and systems and politicians and so forth sitting above them and tying their hands. And I think that the answer is everybody's got a story here, as long as what we're doing is not stopping others' stories being told. And I think perhaps in the past there was a tendency to tell stories all from particularly, well, not so much stories, but I think to tell non-fiction, to report particularly disorders, diseases, mental health issues only from how they were observed from the outside rather than from the inside. But I think fiction's a different matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Some really good points in there. And you have mentioned some feedback from people with lived experience throughout the book. And it sounds like the overall reception has been positive, which is fabulous. But I'm curious about the writing process, and were you able to work with or get consultation from people with different types of lived experiences as you went along?
Yeah, look, I think from different perspectives here. One is obviously that Anne has been working for 30 odd years with people with lived experience. So in that sense, she's in conversation with people like that all the time. And that was our primary source. But then we ran the manuscript past people with lived experience. I mean, a particularly lovely example, I guess, of a beta reader for us was Yen Perkis, who lives with schizophrenia, is autistic, and is non-binary as well. So we have a non-binary character in the book, so it was helpful to get their perspective on our non-binary character and the representation there. But Yen was hugely positive about the book and ended up interviewing us in Canberra. And we had some negative stuff on the manuscript. I mean, at one stage we were looking at calling the book The Fish Tank or The Fish Bowl, for the same reason that it's ended up being called The Glass House, because of the acute psych ward being surrounded by glass. And from the point of view of the medical people, they see themselves as being in a fishbowl or a glass house because the patients can all see in. It's not one-way glass. But equally, the patients can see themselves as being in a fishbowl. And the idea of calling it, even though it's called in the vernacular, the fishbowl in a book, communicated perhaps the idea that the patients were sort of exotic, strange things to be watched and looked at, observed. So some patients, some people with lived experience liked it, some people didn't. So we canned it.
Yeah. And this isn't your first time writing together as co-authors. Has anything changed since the last time you worked together, or what's that process like?
Well, Graeme in particular is a planner, and I think working together, you have to have a plan. So in the screenwriting kind of fashion, we have cards and we put them all out, 120, shuffle them around.
So these are index cards that we write on to scene by scene to lay out the plan for the book.
But in our previous series, 2 Steps Forward and 2 Steps Onward, we were different characters. So we alternated chapters. He wrote the bitter divorcee man and I wrote the flaky widow. Even though there was a plan, we did write alternating chapters. The Glass House is totally in my sphere. This is my world. So once we're done with the plan, I wrote the entire book first draft with the 1.5 chapters exceptions. And at the beginning of every chapter is a vignette in the patient's world. And in fact, Graeme wrote all of those. So obviously after we discussed it, what they were going to say. Then, of course, with the Glasshouse, we had 29 drafts. So there was a lot of editing and changing. And part of that was also shifting my voice, because I think the first draft was a bit much me of 35 years ago, and that's not very millennial. So we needed to millennialise Hannah. I supervise current registrars, so it was already in the current training program in my head, but some of the attitudes and things that I had are very different to current generations. So we shifted that over the next 29 drafts.
And by the time we did the Oasis, we had it down, or very close to having it down, and that went much more smoothly. And we've just submitted the third book to our publishers, the first draft of it. And doing that again, we'd profited from having those 2 practice runs.
That's amazing. How many books do you plan for in the series?
Well, because it follows Hannah, who's a psych trainee, you shift every 6 months. So we figured there was actually 8 in it if we really, wanted to extend that far, though we weren't sure how exciting some of those rotations would be.
Psychogeriatrics might not be as exciting, but forensics, for example, or child and adolescent. Yeah.
So we doubt if we'll make 8, because it will really depend on the publisher and how many people keep buying it. But the Oasis is doing quite nicely. And we were talking with our publisher about a potential 4th, and she's keen but needs to run it past the sales team. So the third...
By the way, let me say, that's the ultimate answer. She needs to run it past the sales team. If the books keep selling, we will keep writing.
Yeah,
brilliant.
Wonderful.
And we could go beyond 8 because, of course, once she graduates, she'll still be a psychiatrist, and we could have her off doing things as well.
Plenty more stories to be told. Yeah.
Well, that's a message to the listeners then. Go out and buy a copy if you haven't yet.
Absolutely. Oh, and are you able to reveal any details about the third book? Do you have, for example, a title reveal or anything you can share with us at this stage?
I'll tell you what, because we were in public with our publisher in the audience the other night up in the Gold Coast, a couple of nights ago, we ran the title for the third one past the audience because our publisher's got some doubts, so it may change. So the working title is The Basement. So we've had the Glass House, the Oasis, the next one's The Basement, because it's about psychiatrists working in...
General Hospital or consultation liaison psychiatry. So, and of course their office is down in the basement, which really kind of pretty much represents where the medical profession feels psychiatry is. The surgeons are up here, the cancer specialists, the cardiothoracic specialists, particularly the interventionist ones, are all considered higher up the hierarchy. And the poor old CL office is in the basement, which it was taken from real life. CL, where I worked once upon a time, was in the basement.
I like it.
Wonderful.
What do you think?
I'm intrigued, so I like it
I'm very
too.
intrigued.
Let me just... Interesting flag in this one, because we're just getting feedback from our beta readers now, and they're saying, "Oh my God, this is so much more impactful and than what this is really tearing me to bits." This book, because it's set in a general hospital and we're dealing with physical illnesses, so the patients are there for some physical reason as well as whatever mental health issues might need some intervention. So you've got people with cancer, you've got people who've had spinal injuries, you've got people with burns injuries and so forth. And in many ways, that reaction is the raison d'etre for our writing these books, that mental health isn't seen as being as serious in the reader's mind. There's still that idea maybe they could just snap out of it. It's not as bad to have anorexia nervosa, which you might die of, major depression, which might also kill you, schizophrenia, which might massively change your life in this, to at least the extent that someone with a spinal injury might have. But somehow people say, oh no, it'd be so much worse to have a spinal injury or burns or whatever.
When you have, say, a spinal injury, you likely will also have depression, and that the relationship between the two can make both worse, I suppose. Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, there's a moment in the third book in progress at the moment where a burns patient, the psychiatrist has cleared out to make room for people who are doing the physical stuff. And she just comments, the physical stuff always takes priority, even though the reason for the burns, because it's potentially a suicide attempt, were likely psychological.
Yeah.
And certainly in dealing with them going forward, the issue is very much likely to be more psychological and physical.
Yeah.
Interesting. And what you're saying, it certainly strikes me. In my PhD is all about stigma and stigma reduction relating to mental illness. And one of the common ways that people are trying to intervene to reduce stigma is to try to emphasize to people that mental illness is an illness and should be seen akin to physical illness in terms of how we take it seriously, how we talk about it, the funding that should be going towards it, the space and the time that we're given towards mental ill health should be equivalent to, but in some scenarios, perhaps preferenced ahead of physical illness. So yeah, that's just reminding me of that kind of those intervention strategies that are happening in the stigma reduction space quite broadly at the moment.
I mean, we talk about these books being structured like a TV season, and you could just keep naming medical TV dramas or comedies or whatever you like that have run successfully for a long period of time that deal with physical illness, and there are almost none that deal with mental illness. Almost none. You really have to go out there. Our agent, when we were shopping the story around for adaptation, said couldn't find anything equivalent.
I'm not surprised. We're not in the mainstream media anyway. Both books have offered a really detailed view into the inner workings of what it looks like on a psychiatric ward and what it looks like in an emergency setting in all its imperfections. How do you balance the details and the intricacies of clinical practice with storytelling? And were there any creative liberties that you had to take for the purpose of telling a good story?
Actually, it was interesting. We just had some feedback from a beta reader who said who's an expert consultation liaison psychiatrist on the third book, with him saying, "I'll leave it to you to balance tedious technical correctness against literary license." Look, our basic rule is we want it to be 100% authentic, and Anne is actually responsible for that. At the end of the day, if you read something in that book and say that could not happen, or that is not the treatment that anyone would prescribe for this, or that is an incorrect portrayal of CBT or whatever it might be, then the buck stops with Anne. If you are bored reading it, then the buck stops with me. So you've got this what might seem like a trade-off between drama and authenticity, but in fact, it's more about going a little bit lighter on some of the technical details and saying, look, we're not going to be wrong here, but we're going to skim over some of the things that might have happened, and let those, and the technical reader can say, well, that must have happened in the background or whatever. What happens in real life is typically dramatic enough that we don't need to enhance it. But we had one case in the Oasis. It's a case of Valerie, who's our
chronic pain patient.
Yeah, chronic pain. Yes. And when we ran it past our beta reader, and Valerie takes some action. Valerie basically becomes empowered and takes some action on her own behalf. And we ran it past our beta reader who works in that area, and he said, unrealistic. I know these guys, and these guys get caught up in the legal system and the court system. They're constantly trying to prove how sick they are. It's a vicious circle thing that makes them worse, and so on and so forth. And Anne came back to me with that and said, you have to change the story. And I was a bit invested in the story. So I said, hold on, it can't be everybody. There's got to be exceptions. Well, there might be exceptions from time to time. So, okay, let's make her an exception, and we'll have somebody in the book take the position of our beta reader and say, what normally happens is blah and blah and blah. And then Hannah sees she's dealing with an exception. And the thing with that is that nobody's going to be misled in that. We get the lecture about what normally happens, and then we say, okay, here's an outlier. So we serve both masters. But as it turned out,
I was reading a book by Graeme Simsion because we were on a panel with him, and it's called The Cop Who Fell to Earth. And he has PTSD, and he talks about leading to that. And he talks about getting caught in the legal system and how he was seeing that he was going to end up dead, that this was just sucking him down. And he made a conscious decision to say, nope, I'm getting out of this.
Just like Valerie.
Just like Valerie. And interestingly, of course, the light bulb went on in my head is that the people that I saw in medical panels and that my expert that read it saw are the ones that are stuck in the system, and that's why we're seeing them. And of course, the ones that don't get stuck in the system, we don't see. So that kind of made this feel much more authentic.
Yeah, it's interesting when you're in the clinical space, the measuring stick is a bit different, I suppose, and what's actually perhaps happening in the outside world. Yeah.
Yeah, the other one was the very beginning of the Oasis is the vignette about DJ getting out of the chronic locked ward. And when it was originally written, the way she was going to escape, I just said to Graeme, no way is this, someone who's been in a hospital for a long period of time, overweight with antipsychotics, no way she's shimming up ropes and rope ladders and things. So we rewrote her how she actually gets out, still leaving the fun part of it in, but she actually gets out in a way that I think, yep, that could happen. So that was, I thought, a good balance.
Yeah, that was a great opening to the book. It's very dramatic.
And a bit funny.
I could certainly see that being the season opener of season 2 of the TV series as well.
Yeah. And you have to ask, you say, could this happen? And the answer is, it really actually comes down to our character, Frodo. Could you imagine someone doing that? And look, I think that's within the realms of imagination of what someone might do under those circumstances. So we have, okay, away we go. And we're not in any way, with what he does, misrepresenting a clinical situation or even the security situation that you might have in a long-term secure environment.
We'd love to talk about Hannah and her interests in psychological therapies, despite the fact that she's working in a system that is pretty much medical, biologically based, I suppose. Sometimes we find it hard to read the sections where other characters doubt the validity of our work, especially as psychologists.
Just a little bit confronting.
Can you tell us about the character's training in psychotherapy and its limitations?
Look, we're pretty positive about the psychologists. Our son is a psychologist and he's married to a psychologist. And in the glass house, Elena is the golden child psychologist. I got into psychiatry because of my love of family therapy, and I think that shows in some of the family therapy scenes that I've put in there. And my own personal experience, well, book 1, the theme really was the battle for the soul of psychiatry. And there's a little bit of battle kind of between psychologists and psychiatrists with that. There's a whole group of psychiatrists who want to go off and just be real doctors and the biological. And I guess part of the reasons some of the patients we chose in the first book was to show you just can't do that as far as I'm concerned. So postpartum psychosis has fabulous treatments in the biological realm. ECT and antipsychotics and lithium work a treat. They get you better. You've got a really great prognosis. But those medications or any other antidepressants are not going to treat the fact that you're not bonded to your baby, that your husband doesn't trust you and your mother-in-law hates you, and the impact that that's going to have on you. Now, whether that's a psychologist or a psychiatrist, I think ultimately in the outpatient setting, it will be psychology that is dealing with that. But in the acute setting, you can't ignore that. And we certainly have psychologists on our ward that are part of our team. But what we really wanted to show was the ignorance and both sides of what people think and feel. So we've got our Freudian psychiatrist who's very dismissive of the psychologists, and it gets even worse in the third book because there's a battle going on between the psychologists as to who reports to who in the CL, because they both have a very important role.
Based on real life. And
unfortunately everything we've put in there is pretty authentic. We can go to some place and time where this has happened. But we also wanted to kind of have a place of actually explaining what is happening. In the glass house, we got Elena in her private practice, sort of doing CBT essentially with a writer with writer's block. And Hannah's pretty dismissive of that initially because, of course, her world is the severe anorexia, the acute inpatient ward where people are being booted out after 2 weeks. But we wanted to show that for her to kind of reflect on it and think this is the early intervention stuff that we really need. And on our tour, we actually one of our opening acts was an author or who was writing his daughter's manuscript
Marsha Moran.
The book, Marsha Moran had written Pomegranate Soup, but she, in the words of her father, lost her life after a battle with writer's block. And he was trying to write and finish the manuscript that she struggled over. And so it was kind of really poignant to us to sort of show, life imitating art, that how that early intervention is incredibly important. And we see a little bit more of that in the Oasis, except the problems with accessibility. So Taylor is a particularly good example of the problems with our mental health system. I don't think anyone has
Borderline personality disorder.
has good treatments for complex PTSD or borderline personality disorder, particularly for those ones that are really struggling, that don't turn up to appointments. And neither a private psychologist or a private psychiatrist is going to be able to hang in with someone, particularly in the early phase of treatment, someone who doesn't keep turning up. You're paying rent. You can't keep, keeping that hour free for someone who doesn't pay.
I have to say, as an outsider here, but someone who's got a systems and business background, you look at it and you say that there are the sort of battles and disputes you would expect to have given the nature of the system, which will rebate psychologists from lesser number of sessions than it would rebate someone using psychodynamic psychotherapy, using a Lacanian or Freudian approach, who would therefore be a psychiatrist or whatever. And there's absolutely artificial divisions that happen here based on the economics of and the funding of mental health, it seems to me. The other thing standing outside it was absolutely seeing this divide within psychiatry between the biological approaches and the more psychodynamic approaches. It was interesting. We've just come from the Australian Psychiatry Congress up in the Gold Coast, and there was a session on psychodynamic psychotherapies aimed at young people who were looking at entering that side of things as psychiatrists. Huge attendance. Apparently very popular session. So it's not like it belongs to the past. And then you've got I hear psychiatrists talking about psychologists. I hear psychologists talking about psychiatrists, and there's not always the level of mutual respect that you would like to see. There are definitely some battle lines drawn around that.
I've certainly witnessed that myself from my side as a psychologist, in the way that people are talking about psychiatrists, but also heard the inverse too.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of perspective shifting that happens between the two professions, even though their end goal is very similar.
And Elena comes in the book at one point and really berates the psych profession, as it were. Says, all you need is this amount of experience in psychotherapy, and you can go and hang out a shingle and see somebody for 50 sessions. And she's pretty coruscating about that. So we do feel that the psychologist's voice is on the page.
And certainly when it comes to training, and the psychologist has always been an absolutely essential part of my inpatient unit management. It's kind of always been there and always will. But in training wise, psychologists get trained extremely well in CBT, mindfulness, all of the new sort of variations of it now. Psychiatrists, not so much so. They get a little bit in it, and they do one case, and then they do one case of psychotherapy, 40 sessions. That's it. There's a little bit of background theory they do, but really it's you've got to go out and do it extra. I did extra family therapy training.
Hang on, you've got to. You're saying...
Sorry, if you're interested to, but you don't have to. No, you can go out after you're qualified. What most would do, though, would be have some time in the public sector, but then that's still only preparing them for supportive psychotherapy, really. Without extra training and supervision, psychiatrists, probably not psychologists either, are not really psychodynamic psychotherapists. That needs extra.
I think in the private space, there's not a lot of collaboration. From my experience anyway, everyone is so busy, it's so hard to try and collaborate with the psychiatrists, and so I think that probably feeds into that divide as well. But also, don't get me started on the Medicare rebate. I'm an educational and developmental psychologist. There's that 2-tier rebate happening, so there's that divide as well. Yeah.
And Hannah's obviously, she's thrown in the deep end with some of the client or patient work that she starts with as well. might intend to just be doing some light supportive therapy under the supervision of Elena, but before you know it, a patient doesn't necessarily match your expectations a lot of the times too, and she's dealing with quite complicated cases despite her training too. So I can see why she, that naturally lends itself to some dramatic story beats in the Oasis.
And look, it wouldn't happen today, but back when I trained, I had a tailor started in first year psychiatry with Taylor as my psychotherapy patient. And that continued probably a couple of years with supervision, excellent supervision, learnt more from that patient than any other thing in psychiatry. And she still rings me a couple of times a year, just to let me know how she's going. And she was amazing.
That's great. And sometimes learning on the job is the best way to learn. I know that from my own experience, everything, you can have a lot of theory in your university training, but it's only once you're actually doing the work that it's going to consolidate and you're going to understand the complexities and how to actually apply these things.
I might in every book, we have to, in the first few pages, explain the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. Yes. And it's almost, there are readers who I don't care. They're all the same thing virtually. So these, these complexities of the interactions and the relative roles. I mean, even as a writer and someone who's been living with a psychiatrist for 40 odd years, it's not always clear to me how that would land.
It's not always clear to me, and I work in the system. So. Yeah.
But I would say that patient that I saw as a psychotherapy patient, and look, I saw her for more than 2 years, but just not as a psychotherapy patient. It was much more supportive. But recently when she rang me, she sort of thanked me and basically put it in her words, said what the research shows is. She didn't tell me I had no skills, but I had no skills back then. And she basically said, the reason, I got better with you is because you cared. And that's what she needed. She'd had a dreadful background.
And a nurse can do that?
Well, yeah, a trained, you need some training and supervision to be able to hold it and someone holding you to do that. But yeah, you don't need CBT skills or even, a lot of experience in psychodynamic psychotherapy with great interpretations to be able to essentially give the component of what a lot of our core work is about, actually just caring and sitting with that patient over a long period of time.
Yeah, I think that was cited a lot during my course, psychology course. 85% of the work is therapeutic alliance.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on the other side of it, I suppose, when you do invest a lot in your work and you work in the mental health space, it can lead to burnout. And mental health and burnout of healthcare professionals is a recurring topic in the series so far. Do you think we place unrealistic expectations on healthcare professionals to be perfect?
Look, I think the general public and some of the response to this book has been very much that they, like our daughter, read it and was appalled at how little Hannah knew and that she was Googling things. She then went into the public obstetric system and suffered because she thought registrars knew everything. So she failed to take that lesson into the next part of her experience. But, I think there is this huge disparity in expectations and reality. Our registrars, I think they're actually more stressed now than they were. The whole system is under an enormous amount of pressure. And the amount of, we talk about this a bit in the third book, the amount that they have to do each rotation, officially get done and ticked off and cases done, it's an enormous pressure. And it's at a time when they're finding partners, having children.
We got interviewed at one stage by an interviewer who said, look, I'm just a bit shocked here that here's Hannah and she's got all this responsibility and so forth, but she's just broken up from a relationship. She's jumping into another relationship. And we said, yeah, she's 27 years old. Yeah. This is what people do at 27 years old. She's a 27-year-old human being who's trying to do this particular job, and not some sort of stereotype of the perfect medical professional.
And I think the other pressure that they have now, which I didn't have, is the length of stay. So I think our length of stay at the Austin was something like 16 days average in the acute ward. It's 9 days down in the peninsula. So there's this enormous pressure. And then you have more discharge summaries. We had the option back in, the bad old days of keeping you as long as you like, just moved wards, had people there for months. Of course, there's huge negatives with that, but it did take away from some of that pressure that now that they're under.
There's definitely pressure coming from multiple angles there too. And another prominent theme in the Oasis is the rights of people with complex mental health issues versus the responsibility of healthcare professionals. So, for example, through characters like DJ Voices who are dealing with community treatment orders. And this can be quite a controversial topic. What did you keep in mind while writing those subplots that were focusing on dignity of risk?
Well, indeed, just that. And that was kind of very much in my head, the dignity of risk. At our launch of the Glass House, Heidi Everett, who wrote a book called My Friend Fox about her experience with schizophrenia, spoke. And she spoke very powerfully about the dignity of risk. And it sort of took my breath away. I don't sign those forms very often in perinatal psychiatry, but over my lifespan, I have many times because I've worked in other areas and on call, etc. And I don't think I will ever sign one of those without thinking that and really thinking it through. And it's this really difficult balance about the risk to community or the risk to the patient through non-compliance, etc. That do we allow them, and should we even be able to say that, allow them to? But ultimately, when you're sitting there about to sign that form, this is the sort of question that, which is the bigger risk? And I mean, in the best of all possible worlds, there'll be a plan there that they've done when they're well, obviously not for their first episode, but subsequently, that you can follow what they want. But that's not always possible, not always sitting there. And we really wanted that in DJ's or Heidi's voice, or someone like Heidi's voice coming through DJ.
And as you know, the outcome of the book for DJ is not 100% happily ever after, and we don't want to put these things on the page as advocates and gloss over and say, let's give you the happy ending version. Let's see the people who oppose that view are all baddies wearing black hats and twirling their moustaches, but rather let's see the different points of view which are sincerely held, and see the sometimes ambiguous outcomes that come from it, and make your own calls. We want to see the various possibilities laid out so people can say, do we have this community treatment order or should we not? How do we balance it?
And more than anything else, psychiatry and psychology is not black and white. That there is a lot of grey and complexity in the cases we see.
100%. And I'm sure a lot of readers will be, as you flagged, are starting to get more of a window into what that looks like and the difficult decisions that characters like Hannah and her colleagues have to make day to day in real life, of course, as well.
Yeah. And we only have one more question to go. Do you have any book or author recommendations to share with our listeners?
Okay, well look, I think if someone's listening, I do these things every year for the age and that sort of thing. And I think, look, I've got books that I like reading and so forth, but why would anybody care what I liked? I think that people are interested in what I might like because they've read the Rosie Project or whatever, and therefore I frequently recommend books in the autism space and say, well, okay, I'm now familiar with that space. So I guess in the broader mental health space, which is of course what we're writing about in the Glass House and the Oasis, I think it's really good to read the lived experience books and compare and contrast them with the fictional representations. I mean, you say, well, this is reality. Did Anne and Graeme do it fairly in the fictional treatment? What else could I learn about this? So, by the way, in the autism space, I think John Elder Robison's book, Look Me in the Eye, is still a fine book from a female perspective, because I think the presentations can be quite different. Well, presentations can be quite different across people. Clem Bastow and Australian late bloomer. In the space that we've been writing about, Anne talked about Craig Semple's book, The Cop Who Fell to Earth. It's a very fine memoir that will actually make you really know at the end of it what PTSD and major depression looks like. And it's, in a very visceral sort of sense, because here's the big cop, here's the story, and whoomp, this is where they've ended up.
I'd have to add in Because I'm Not Myself, You See, by Ariane Beetson. She and I were reading our manuscripts at the same time and puffed each other. But hers is a very fine, beautifully written memoir about postpartum psychosis. And she works in the field. She works for COPE. She's actually a psychologist. So she does a fine job of it, of kind of conveying how terrifying it is, really.
And we mentioned Heidi Everett. So her book, My Friend Fox, Schizophrenia Memoir, very finely written as well. Strongly recommended.
Wonderful. We had Ariane on the show last year. So listeners, if you're keen to hear more about Ariane's story, I'm not myself, you see, please go and check out that episode as well. I think that wraps us up for today.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Anne and Graeme, for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
guys. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.
A huge thank you to Anne and Graeme for coming on the pod once again. It's always such a fun conversation.
Absolutely. As usual, our detailed show notes are available on novelfeelings.com, including the author's social media handles and their book recommendations. And both The Glass House and The Oasis are out now through Hachette Publishing, so go and check them out.
That wraps us up for today. If you like us, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Find us online on Instagram and YouTube through novel_feelings, or search Novel Feelings Community on Facebook.
If we've entertained you or taught you something, please consider buying us a coffee to show your thanks. All proceeds go towards making the show stronger and more sustainable. All links are in our show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks to Graeme and Anne for coming on the pod.
Bye.
Our podcast was recorded on Wurundjeri Land, which is home to both of us in Naarm, Melbourne.
We also acknowledge the role of storytelling in First Nations communities.
Always was,
Always will be.
Aboriginal Land.